Is it reasonable to expect Scotts Valley to balance its growth with what? Oh, conservation. Okay, is it reasonable to expect Scotts Valley to balance its growth with conservation and acquire recharge programs so that it at least stabilizes its use of groundwater?
The short answer is yes. We already are doing it.
Is it on? Here, take that.
Short answer is yes, we're already doing it. It has been in balance. The levels have been stable for the last 10 years. But what's amazing is I have the pleasure to sign every single check that goes out of Scotts Valley Water District. And it's amazing how many rebates are still coming through. And I look at each of those applications where I see that there's a 5-gallon per flush toilet still, 3.2 gallon per flush toilet, and these days they're 0.8. So those are coming through still. There's a lot of old stock in housing in Scotts Valley. So we're not talking about the new development being efficient. We still have a lot of room to make the existing stock more efficient, indoors and out. The other thing I see all the time is the turf coming out and native landscaping going in. People are realizing it's not only savings in water, but they don't have to do the mowing anymore. So absolutely, I don't think there is any question in my mind that the growth that you saw, the little water drop there, can be balanced by more efficient use.
Okay. I found the card I was looking for because I had actually, during a break, I'd asked a couple people to take a look at it. I'm going to read it as it was written. There's a profanity thing here. So, just saying. Not a big one, but kind of small. SGMA has a public trust requirement. However, Guiding Principle 10 is a very weak-kneed, half-assed addressing of public trust. The sustainability criteria is groundwater levels in the 2015 drought. This will do nothing to protect the public trust. Yet, Guiding Principle 10 says SGMA will only examine the possibility of raising groundwater above 2015. Care to respond? Where'd John go? Is John still there? Oh, there he is.
I can respond to that, and I think I would have to agree with that comment that it is kind of a weak position. I was surprised to see that because I thought we had all agreed to a much stronger, more proactive position on that, and I think we have. I mean, I think the agency really is committed to. I mean, we said we were going to examine. What we really want to do is we want to do it. We need to look at the ways to do it. We need to make sure it's feasible, but we want to restore the groundwater basin, and we do want to restore those stream flows. And I've heard that from all the member agencies. And I think we're required to do that under SGMA. SGMA sort of says, you can't make things any worse than they were in January of 2015. That's that reference to 2015. But we want to do better than that.
Coming to go this next one to Eric. That's all right. Our community has a history of working together to conserve water well when we feel urgency about needing to. Based on news reports, other areas in the state have not done that as well. Low turnout of water meetings mentioned by Eric Ekdahl suggest inattention to conservation needs in many other parts of the state. Are we at risk in the future of having the state take our water to send it to other areas that don't plan or conserve as well? And yes, there was our water in there. Okay. So are we at risk in the future of having the state take our water to send it to other areas that don't plan or conserve as well?
So two responses. There was a tremendous response statewide to the conservation mandates that came out in 2014, both from the State Water Board and then from the governors through his executive orders. The state collectively saved usually somewhere between about 20 and 26% relative to their 2013 baseline. Some communities were up at 40 or even 45%. And for the most part, that savings has stuck around. So people haven't gone back to their 2013 use levels. In addition to that, the governor charged the State Water Board, Department of Water Resources to put together a conservation framework. We did that. That report came out in 2017, and there were two bills passed last year, SB 606 and 1668, that set a path for how you can actually look at statewide community driven conservation levels and what's an appropriate level of water use at the community that reflects the local environment and climate and kind of takes all that into account. Interestingly, the bills set a indoor use of 55 gallons per person per day as kind of the standard or baseline use that maybe drops a little bit in the future. That's just for the indoor part. And so if you look at Santa Cruz's, at least, water use, they've been below 50 total for years. So that's, something that's very achievable and maybe even sets the bar a little too high. That's part one of the answer. Part two is no, they're not going to look at taking your water here and giving it to somewhere else because there are already other places where that's much easier and much more cost effective. Basically the Bay Delta. The Bay Delta supplies water for 25 million people and millions of acres of irrigated agriculture. That infrastructure is largely already in place. You don't have the infrastructure here and you don't have the water supply here. If you're talking, 10,000 acre feet total, maybe collectively that you want to exercise kind of within the basin, that's half a day's worth of pumping out of the Bay Delta. So no.
Thank you. An interesting aside on to the two bills that Eric just spoke of. This is an oversimplification, but I would say that in like the last 10 years, there have been three very important rounds of conservation legislation. The first was around 2007, so the SBX 7-7, and then we had the executive order B blah, 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 something. And that set what was called Water Conservation Framework. The Water Conservation is a Way of Life, and then these new two pieces of legislation. The reason I focus a bit more on that is that these new two pieces of legislation are the next real round where there's going to be a lot of stakeholder activity. A lot of stakeholder activity is going to be sort of more people from different agencies, but you should talk to your agency people here about whether they're being involved or volunteering to be, because there's going to be about 6 or 7 different water conservation dialogues on different projects, different types of activities going on statewide. They're just kicking off now. One, actually, there's a question in here that I'll try to get to that's related to it. It's called the County Drought Advisory Group that has to do with how is drought being handled in these highly rural areas. And there's going to be several others, landscape use, wholesale water use, things like that. So again, as increasingly educated water consumers, be aware of whether your agencies are trying to be actively involved in these stakeholder think tanks that are going to go on, which are going to set recommendations to go back to the legislature. So my 2 cents on that. Okay. Twitchell Reservoir in San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara County. I understand that Twitchell Reservoir is used for groundwater recharge only. How is that working? Anybody got any insight on that? On Twitchell Reservoir? Dokie dokie. All right, given the difficulties overcoming environmental concerns with regards to large reservoirs on creeks, what about smaller check dams with fish ladders for local use for water infiltration? This is going to be more of a localized question, so.
Is this working? Okay. A lot of our creeks right now, the groundwater is already up to the surface where the creeks are located. There's only a few places where they're not. So you wouldn't get a lot of infiltration at those locations into the groundwater basin. We really need to get the infiltration more higher up and away from the creeks. And then just the issue of getting in and modifying a channel runs into all kinds of different permit requirements. So it would be a lot of work for probably fairly small returns.
So I just would add that fish passage is one of the biggest barriers to having a real viable population. And there already are a lot of challenges in some of the tributary streams from historic, dams that made pools for people to swim in during the summer, et cetera, that create fish passage issues. Even if you put in a fish ladder, those things aren't maintenance free, and they don't always work the way that you imagine they did. So I don't personally think that that's a good strategy to take a situation that is already complicated and make it more complicated for the fish based on the idea that somehow we would get a benefit, which is questionable based on what John just said.
Okay, it's a question to somebody from SLV. We were told that SLV had the right to 10% of Loch Lomond. Not true?
Not true.
That was an amazing ventriloquist act, wasn't it? Rick sounded just like Rosemary.
Might I answer this question? All right. The agreement is not a right. It's a contractual agreement between the City of Santa Cruz and the San Lorenzo Valley Water District for 100 million gallons, approximately 313.4 acre feet. And the arrangement was made as a result of a land transaction that occurred when Newell Creek Dam was created. And that is the basis for the arrangement for the 100 million gallons from Loch Lomond to go to San Lorenzo. Until I think the surface water treatment rule went into place in the late 80s, some of that water at least was being used. It has not been used more recently because of a requirement to get it to a place through a surface water treatment plant before it can be used. Anything to add?
I agree with that.
Great.
Okay. This is an interesting question in particular because it's not directly to Eric, but since Eric is up here representing the state. We have had many plans and very little action. How is this going to be different?
Because now there's regulatory authority. And so, going back to the talk, for 100 years, there was really no oversight of groundwater. And there were requirements for plans, and people put really nice plans together. But until there's sometimes this threat of regulatory action sitting over people, it's hard to motivate any action. And so now there's very clear regulations and guidelines that say you must address 6 undesirable results if you have them all. You must show how you're going to measure them and set thresholds for them. You must show how you're going to manage to avoid those thresholds. And if you fail, here's the things that are going to happen to you. So is it going to be quite like the state swooping in with its vans and helicopters and regulating wells? No, it
You
won't be
have
anything
those.
like
See,
that.
I knew it. I knew you.
Our secret stash of helicopters that the state has. That's a joke, by the way.
There's cameras, you know that.
There
right?
will be no. That's why I said specifically that is a joke.
Former deputy director from State Board.
The board places a lot of emphasis on community engagement and outreach and dialogue, even when it's in a regulatory action. And that sometimes is maybe why it takes a little bit longer for action to actually occur. We like to talk to people. We like to get the different perspectives and stakeholder input. But in the end, we still do have that regulatory authority.
Absolutely, sir.
So just a note on some of the local plans that I mentioned. Action has been taken based on those plans. Some of the, not all of the projects proposed were done, obviously, but they were all assessed, and some projects did go in, Newell Creek Dam being one of them. The interties, more use of groundwater, getting people off of surface water diversions. There has been a lot of action taken by the plans, especially for the projects that were feasible. A lot of projects that were proposed in some of those early plans just really weren't feasible, and that's why no action was taken on them and why we're still trying to figure out what we can do now.
And just to add even more to that, all the projects that Tim listed, those come out of a planning process. And there have been tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars that kind of intertie with those. And there has been a lot of new water developed because of them. So to say that, Sierra's exactly right, that a lot of things have been done because of those plans and a lot of good work has come out of it.
So there were a couple of cards that came in. I tried to group a couple of these different sets of similar questions. These first 2 cards really had to do with retention strategies at a private property level. So basically, it's what stormwater retention or rainwater capture strategies are feasible for homeowners. What can homeowners do to capture rainwater and be a part of hopefully a solution in terms of grabbing the water and retaining it?
There are a number of things you can do. A lot of that depends on your soils and your slopes and where you are in the watershed on what you can do. If you're relatively flat and have sandy soils, you can put almost all of your water into the ground by capturing it and letting it soak in either through trenches or basins or that sort of thing. But if you're on a steeper slope and the soils are not so permeable, more clay soils, there may not be as much as you can do. You really want to still make sure you're preventing erosion. The Resource Conservation District will come out and provide advice, technical assistance on things that can be done. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in doing that, to contact the Resource Conservation District.
I have something to add from Scotts Valley Water District. We do have a rebate for water cistern. It is just something, unfortunately, considering our climate here, you can collect all of the water for maybe in the future 2 months, but for now 4 months, and it doesn't go too far unless the container is really, really big. It's amazing how much water gets used in the landscape just in one day when it's a peak time. But we do encourage that. So if people who are willing to and have the place to put such, maybe 500 gallon, maybe 1,000 gallon, maybe 10,000 gallon. But if you look at it, how much you use, it's just something that you have to assess yourselves if you would like to add that to your water portfolio.
Okay. Another couple of questions came in pretty similar. And this has to do, Brett, while you've got the mic. You made the claim that stormwater collection costs about $30,000 per acre foot, without stating this is a capital one-time improvement cost and not ongoing costs. Why are you not looking at future cost savings? And a similar question was, most of the presenters related their costs to upfront costs, not 50 to 100 year per annum costs. The benefits of the solutions discussed will last for many years. So
it is both. It is capital cost and operating cost. The capital cost was amortized over 30 years. And we assume at the end of 30 years, like any facility anybody ever undertakes, needs to be fully replaced or repaired. So it is a one-time cost, but it is taken over the lifetime of that facility. So we're looking at, and every facility is different. I mean, that's what we kind of do day in, day out when we look at the suite of projects. What makes sense and how can we make the lifetime cost of that most reasonable for our ratepayers?
okay, another bracketing of questions that came in. What proportion of water rights in our area are pre-1914? Anybody have a sense? If she sounds just like Rick Rogers, that's going to be really, really impressive.
I don't sound like Rick Rogers on this one, I don't think. So I would say that with respect to the Santa Cruz's total water rights, about 25% of our water comes from pre-14 water from the North Coast sources. And I don't know if you know, Jen or Rick, the percent roughly of yours that's pre-14?
Our north system is 100% pre-1914, up in the Boulder Creek, Petaluma area. Felton is post, and it gets 100% of its surface water from 100% of its water supply.
Sure.
I would say about 50% of the surface water, in the north system, where 100% of the water, that surface water is pre-1914, that provides about 50% of the consumption for the year. So in the north system, it's about 50% of the total consumption, and then of the whole system wide, it'd be maybe 30%. So it's some fraction. So I don't know off the top of my head, but just there's some calculation.
Okay, Jen, actually, while you got the mic, this is a question that had come in much earlier when you had been speaking in one of the statements. Please comment on how the plan for saving high rainfall excess will work. How much water could be counted on? What defines excess more specifically, and how's that going to be determined under SGMA?
Well, we are now, we have a contract with a fish biologist, and we are looking for what fish passage requirements would be in the upper watershed in the San Lorenzo River. So when we divert water from our stream sources in the upper watershed, we're still in the process of developing that number, and that's what we will bring once we have that plan prepared. But that's what we're looking at, is to how much water is necessary for fish, and then how much would be left over that we could divert. And another one of the pinch points is really logistically, how much water can we move through the pipe, and how much water can be treated by the treatment plant. So it's not just how much water do the fish need, but it's also these other more logistical challenges as well.
Rosemary, is the city of Santa Cruz looking into using wastewater as a reuse source?
Yes. Can I answer? Can I make a comment about the earlier? So if you're watching what's going on with Santa Cruz at all, or see any of our materials, one of the things you'll see is a bunch of analysis, and a big chunk of it is going to come forward at this meeting we're planning on the 1st of April with our Water Commission. But it's focusing on analyzing how much water really is available for in lieu or aquifer storage and recovery. Okay, so just to sort of tell you how we're thinking about it, we're taking the flows that are available to us on a daily basis within generally, and then subtracting fish flow commitments that we've made and that we're working to integrate into our water rights now. And then we're attempting to meet our daily demand. We'll meet our daily demand for water supply. And then the chunk that's left over that's within our water rights is what we're evaluating as what's available for either in lieu or aquifer storage and recovery. I think that sort of gives a sense of at least how we're approaching that. And you'll see a variety we're looking at several different climate change scenarios and how those numbers are related based on both historic and climate change options.
While you've got the mic, last minute card just came in for you. Are in lieu transfers between agencies subject to Prop 218 restrictions, i.e. is the water sold at retail rates? Would there be a way to make it economically viable?
If we were going to enter into a long-term agreement with an entity to provide water for in lieu, we would have to allocate the cost of service to that under Prop 218 and charge them what it costs us to produce and deliver that to them, and so that we could, make sure that our customers are not subsidizing those costs. So the answer is they wouldn't necessarily bear all the same costs that our customers bear, because there are things that aren't involved in sending water through a fairly good-sized pipe through an intertie to someplace else, but it would have to pass the sort of smell test of, are they paying the cost of service? Or our customers would legitimately be able to complain that we were causing them to subsidize service to someone else.
Okay. There were two questions that came in again, sort of similarly, so I'll try to read through them. Has Santa Cruz County considered mandating roof water cisterns on new construction? And if not, why not? And then a related question, for new development stormwater capture, would it make sense to also look at it from a fire safety standpoint to get funding for on-site storage tanks?
Interesting question. I hadn't really considered the fire aspect before. One of the big drawbacks of rainwater capture is that it doesn't do you much good in a drought or a dry period because you just don't have the rainfall when you need it the most, when your wildfire hazard is the most significant. They're expensive. They take a long time to sort of get paid off by the water savings. In rural areas where you're on your own well, it makes more sense to put it into the ground where there's a lot more storage, and that storage is not going away. So for those reasons, we're not mandating rooftop collection.
It's a question for SLV. If Fall Creek can't be used during drought, then other surface water would not be able to be used during these times. if the basis is to keep enough water in San Lorenzo River, why, hold on, I got you. Why would Loch Lomond not be required to release water into the river instead? Let me read that again. Here, I'm going to let you, I'm going to hand you the card and you can. All right. If Fall Creek can't be used during drought, then other surface water would not be able to be used during those times as a basis to keep enough water in San Lorenzo River.
Okay, so can I take
Go ahead.
it? That
Yeah,
part?
absolutely.
So our Fall Creek water right is a appropriative water right, and by definition has a very specific quantity that we're allowed to take. And our other surface water sources are pre-1914 water rights, which means we can divert like as much as we can.
Sort of.
We have requirements on Fall Creek for a wet weather and a dry weather that we can take water out of. And there may be a month out of the year, 2 months out of the year that we would not, by the permit, be able to take water during drought, but the rest of the time we'd be able to take water out of Fall Creek. And that's one of the issues that we're trying to solve right now, because we do have times that we're in violation of the Fall Creek permit.
So that was my question, and it was really, it seems like we're totally dependent on Fall Creek and Bennett Springs, but we have other creeks, other surface water sources that, as far as I understand, we've sort of let go and are not using. And so if the reason we can't take the water from Fall Creek at those times is because we need to maintain flow in San Lorenzo for the fish, then would we also not be able to exploit these other surface water sources?
In Felton, the permits read if Fall Creek can't be used, neither can the other two sources. That's Bull Creek and Bennett Creek. And it's been almost impossible for agencies to follow that requirement for quite a while, for over 20 years. It's not a new problem. It's just a problem we need to solve.
But for instance, Shingle Mills Creek or other creeks in Felton,
They were used a long, long time ago, correct.
could they ever be used again?
We don't have facilities. And a lot of those are on private property, and a lot of those are tributaries, and they're probably all tributaries to Fall Creek and Bull and Bennett Creek.
Because I know Shingle Mills is in my neighborhood and people
Right.
along the creek pull water out of the
Correct.
creek.
There's a lot of people that pull out of Shingle Mill.
So would that be legal?
Right. Yeah. We can talk.
During times of mandated conservation, why do water districts seem to make exemptions for food growing areas of a garden, a personal garden? Is there some state law or other legal reason why they do that? And then in parentheses, by the way, as a backyard food grower, I'm in favor of this exemption. And I'll let whoever can answer that answer, and then I will make a comment because it relates to this new group, this County Drought Rural Advisory Group. But anybody want to weigh into that?
So I guess what I would say, at least what we did in Santa Cruz, is we didn't say you couldn't irrigate your garden. We basically gave our residents an allocation. And we said you can get up to 10 units a month, and if you go over that, then you're going to pay a penalty. And we had a lot of people who used more, who ended up going to water school and having their penalty refunded. And our goal was for people to understand what the problem was and what to do, as opposed to make money. So we gave like 2/3 of the total $1.5 million of revenue we generated from penalties back to customers through leak rebates or from having their participation in water school. But we did not say one way or another how you could use the water. If you wanted to, take a 1-minute shower and use the water in your garden, that was completely up to you.
I'll take it. During the drought, during 2015 drought, there are a few people who like to do backyard gardening, and I think it was at the time the board felt like people who wanted to garden are being stewards in other ways of resources, and we were seeing 40% water conservation, and it was quite successful. And so being clear about people being allowed to continue having their food garden was still working. So.
In most of those gardens, people were hand watering and using a very small amount of water to maintain their gardens.
So what I was going to add to this was there's, again, under the legislation that Eric spoke of, the two pieces of legislation, there's a group, it's actually the first sort of project, if you will, it's begun from this, called the County Drought Advisory Group. And they've been meeting about monthly. They just began a couple of months ago. My team facilitates that, works with DWR. And I can tell you that and these folks can attest to it, that there's what's called urban water management planning, and those for agencies or districts that are 3,000 connections or less, or 3,000 connections or more. But the state, and I don't say this in any kind of blame to the state, it's just, this is another example of what happens when you have a state of this size and you have to sort of set rules. When the drought hit and the state was scrambling for ways, every way that they could to deal with water conservation, what became readily apparent is that the state, from a sort of a policy perspective and what was implemented, just really literally, this may sound crazy, but just didn't really have a deep understanding of the unique needs of rural communities and the unique ways in which rural communities and rural individual landowners use water, whether it was for subsistence growing, where some families were being told you can't use water, and a family was saying, that's how we get our food, or it had to do with old antiquated water delivery systems that were increasingly subject to damage by fire risk, or any of these kind of variables. And so this group of CDAG is filling that niche now, finally, to try to get embedded into state policy a deeper understanding of what the rural communities have to deal with and how they can and can't be held subject to certain water conservation conditions. Things that might work in San Jose just simply aren't going to work in Murphy or work in Boulder Creek or something like that. So that's my 2 cents to that. So, okay. At what point do we need to shift thinking away from the old water rates based on usage to rates or taxes that fund much more capital-intensive production and conservation solutions?
I think we are shifting every time when a water agency takes on a potential rate structure change. There's a very extensive process that is required by Prop 218. Everything has to be the cost and benefit. They have to have nexus. You have to really prove that if you do tiered rates, that's what's going to cost you. It is actually in conflict with the type of operating expenses that all of us are occurring. We are heavily fixed cost systems. So our expenses don't change, but the tiered rate system is very much kind of in opposition with that. It kind of is telling you you're buying gallons. No, you're not buying gallons from us. You're buying the deliverance of the service at any time that you can turn on the tap and it's there for you to use. So budget-based rate is something that is kind of the probably most forward-thinking. It is the downside of that. It's much more expensive to administer. It means you're relying on constantly having people to come and report what is their specific condition, how many people they have in a household. People will, of course, come and tell you when an additional person moves in. Would they come and rush to you if a person moves out and report, please lower my allocation? Maybe not so much. Anything else, what they're doing? Is there a vegetable garden? Is there a pool? Is there grass? So that puts more on both sides, on the customer and the agency to do that. But nevertheless, many agencies are considering that. We think maybe that's the most fair way of assessing what is the real cost of the water. Water is still very cheap. I'm sorry to tell you that. I know you all feel differently, or we hear that a lot. But if you look at any other utility that a household is paying, water tends to be the cheapest utility, and it certainly is not the least valuable.
Okay, we got time for a couple more questions before we go to closing comments. What is the county doing about impacts of increased cannabis farming on groundwater and surface water uses? What information do we have about current impacts, and what are our plans for monitoring in order to see if there needs to be limits?
This is an issue the county has dealt with to some extent.
Go ahead, and you probably need to get the mic. I don't know.
There was an environmental impact report that was done when the county first developed its proposed cannabis regulations. There's a lot of information on water use and projected water use in that environmental impact report. Right now, any cannabis user wanting to get licensed has to specify where its water is coming from, how much they're using, and to have permission from the source of that water to do that. They're not allowed to use surface water. If it's groundwater, I think there's a meter requirement on that as well. So it's an evolving issue. The state is actually also very much engaged in the water use aspects of cannabis growing, and to get a license, you have to get permission from the state as well, and they're actually quite a bit more rigorous in the county. We felt like the state was really occupying that area pretty thoroughly, so we rely a lot on the requirements of the state.
All right, let's go. One more question, and to put this in context, that's what I was able to ask. This is what I don't have time for, and there's a whole stack back there. So again, we're going to transcribe everything. You guys beat your record. Scotts Valley, will treated water be treated to take out nitrogen, pharmaceuticals, and nanoparticles before it is pumped into an aquifer? And are these three pollutants taken out now in our water?
Pretty much anything and everything will be taken out. It's an extra caution in addition to the biological travel time that we are required to maintain once we inject. So between the injection well and the production well, how many months of travel time is there that the soils can help us. So it's amazing. We actually have to start putting things back in the water. It's so pure that it almost becomes corrosive to many things and poses its own challenges. So we meet the regs now, regulatory requirements for non-potable use, for irrigation and dust control. It is very heavily regulated. We have to work with the state and submit permits to make sure that it meets the requirements now. And depending on the type of how you put it in the ground, is it surface spreading or injection wells? It's a different set of regulations. Also, there is room for, if you have 6 months travel time versus 2 months travel time, that the regs are different. They give you a different allocation. And then John was mentioning direct potable use. So that is something that state is heavily looking into, because if you're thinking about the cost of you're making a pure water, you're injecting into the ground, it's going to pick up all kinds of naturally occurring elements from there. Then you have to pump it out and you treat it again. That is very costly. So instead of that, is there a way to not do the circle and directly use it? And all of them have very, very extensive safeguards built in.
Okay, let's have a hand of applause for all of our folks. You all can take a seat. Okay, our chair and vice chair of the Santa Margarita Groundwater Agency get the last word. So I will hand the microphone over to Lois, and Brett can hand that one to Chris.
A quick conservation tip. I shower outside all year long. And believe me, you take short showers in the winter. And the summertime, you got to watch out for bees, so you take short showers again. Just a tip. I want to thank you all for coming today. If you've been able to attend previous meetings, then how about a double thanks for you, or triple thanks? You were truly water champions for the basin. Many people have asked, what's next regarding the work of the Santa Margarita Groundwater Agency, and future outreach. Here's what we know.
The agency is selecting a technical consultant to help us prepare our groundwater sustainability plan. This will be finalized in the next few weeks. We are simultaneously preparing a work plan that will describe how the groundwater sustainability plan process will start. What are the key milestones? How will outreach and education be woven through this process? We know we will have interactive workshops by the board as they work with staff and consultant team on key parts of the GSP, Groundwater Sustainability Plan. The acronyms are annoying sometimes. We know that these will always be open to the public to participate in. We know we'll have many additional outreach and educational events mixed in with these board workshops. We're working on a schedule right now, which we'll be refining in the next few months. We don't have anything immediately planned, but as soon as we do, we'll publicize it through our website and our growing email list of stakeholders. We'll keep you posted and urge you to stay actively involved like you have been in the past few months. Also, remember, you guys are our word of mouth, that this is happening. We wish we had 1,000 people here. We're very grateful for not only the amount of participation, but the quality of the participation, but this needs to be multiplied by so much that, to really do this right, there really needs to be more. And we're going to be trying to figure out how to make that happen. But in the meantime, bore your friends and neighbors and tell them what's been happening here so they can be interested. And as a final thing, Lois and I would like to thank the people that made this possible, which is this agency doesn't have their own staff, quote unquote, but between the agencies, all their staffs have been cooperating on a team that has really been doing fantastic work while they do their real jobs, right? And this is like their second job. So I'd like to give them all a round of applause for the hard work they did putting this together. Lois, say goodnight.
Say goodnight. Okay. I would like to say, though, they put up all these tables, they feed us, they provide us with information, staff. So what could we do without them? We wouldn't be able to do anything. So I just want to say, add my thanks. And that's it. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.